This is the story of my first encounter with a odd-like creature I grew to call a skinwalker. I didn't start calling them that until I came face to face with the second one, and I hadn't known that skinwalkers were already a thing. I am now 16, but this happened when I was 9. At the time, I lived in a very, very small town in Michigan called Stockbridge. The town lays outside of a semi-thick wooded area, or so I've been told by my dad. Much of it was cut down. My house was on the outskirts of town, near the woods. There wasn't much to do in town. There were no fun places to go, and I had no video games or TV. So me and my friend, Jake, would spend all of our time outside. As this was the case, both our parents were pretty comfortable with us being outside, without supervision, and let us do what we wanted. The day of this story, it was August, or September, and it was already dusk, but my dad agreed that Jake and myself could take his dog for a walk in the woods, as long as we didn't stay out for too long. We had been walking on a path that led us to a creek, and had been planning to turn back once we'd reached the creek, which was about 15 minutes away from the edge of the woods. We were about 10 minutes into the walk, and Jake's dog, Midnight, had been sniffing everything in reach. He was a well-trained dog most of the time. We could walk him through the woods without a leash, but before the walk, we had made him really excited, and he still hadn't calmed down completely. A small animal, a squirrel, or maybe a rabbit, was crossing the trail ahead of us. It saw Midnight and then ran back the way it came. Midnight, still a bit hyper, bolted after it, ignoring Jake's cries for him to come back. Jake and I ran after Midnight as fast as we could, but we soon lost sight of him, and only had the noise of his barks to follow. The chase lasted a few minutes until we caught up to Midnight. He had stopped to sniff a tree. We took a few moments to catch our breath before we turned to look at the path we'd made crashing through the underbrush. Midnight was now walking happily beside us. We hadn't gone very far when Midnight stopped, sniffing the air. Once again, he turned and ran into the foliage. This time, he wasn't wagging his tail or barking, just running. Again, we chased him, but this time he wasn't going that fast, and kept slowing down, like he wanted us to follow him. We stopped on a small hill that overlooked a clearing. I remember this part perfectly. I've been filling in some of the blanks up to now, with what must have happened, but from here on out, that's not needed. Midnight started to quietly growl, and his fur started to raise. I remember being confused because I couldn't see anything. The noise of movement reached my ears, and as I looked in the direction of the noise, a deer crawled into the clearing. And I mean this deer crawled. Not limped or walked. It crawled like a child. I remember being transfixed on the deer. I saw it had no tail, and that its face and body was oddly human. Its eyes were a bit too wide, and its nose a bit too short and pointed. Its ears a bit too circular. At one point, it got so close I could see that around the pupils its eyes were white. Being able to see this is not normal for a deer. None of us made a sound, not even Midnight. As it walked around the clearing, it must have seen us, but I guess it didn't give a damn, as long as we didn't disturb it. After it walked around the clearing 3 times, it walked closer to the middle. It slowly raised itself to be standing on all 4 legs. Once it did that, it stretched its front legs out for a moment, like a cat. Once it had done stretching, it raised its front legs, kind of like a horse can. Unlike a horse, it raised until its back was straight, and its arms fell to its side. Midnight started barking like someone was trying to kill him. He sounded angry and dangerous. He sounded like this whenever he sensed danger. This was not the first or the last time I would hear Midnight barking like that, but I didn't bat an eye. Instead, I continued staring, unblinkingly, at the deer who was now staring back at us. Its eyes were wider than they had been a moment before, and it froze like a deer caught in headlights. After an unknown amount of time of Midnight's barking and the deer's staring, the deer turned and started running on 2 legs through the woods. It ran like a man, arms swinging slightly up and down like a person can do. It was faster than anything I'd ever seen. Faster than any deer once it's heard a gunshot. Minutes passed and we all stood there, staring, now at the wooded area the deer had ran. Soon, Jake turned to Midnight, who was now relaxed, and told him to walk with us. I remember leaving the clearing, but for the life of me, I can't remember how we found the trail and exited the woods. Both of our parents were terribly angry with us. We had been in the woods for almost an hour by the time we got back, and it was really dark out. We both told them what had happened in the woods, but they said the deer must have been injured or something, even at us insisting that the deer stood up, and they told us it was just our imaginations, and that it was nothing to worry about. Me and Jake talked about it a lot after. We also talked about my second encounter when it happened. Sadly, I moved and have lost contact with Jake.
As a young man, my father spent some time living on the Navajo Indian Reservation in the Four Corners area. He and his buddy lived alone in a trailer that overlooked a ravine several miles away from Navajo Mountain. It wasn't uncommon for he and his friend to hear drums coming from the mountains at night. The locals told them not to go out after dark when the drums were playing because the witches were on the mountain and would try to harm them. My father broke his leg and soon afterward found himself confined to the lonely trailer. One day, his friend had to go out to a meeting, and my father was left alone at the trailer. As night fell, the drums began on the mountain. My father tried to occupy his mind with other things, but soon he began hearing strange sounds just outside the trailer. Footfalls in the yard, things scraping the siding of the trailer, and creaking floorboards on the porch. Leaving his crutches in the trailer, my father grabbed a baseball bat and stepped out onto the porch. Only the empty yard was there to greet him. He heard a sound behind him and spun around. Nothing was there. Thinking an animal or person might be sneaking around the trailer, he crept off the porch, squeezing the baseball bat, and headed toward the corner of the trailer. But when he rounded the corner, nothing was there either. The hairs began standing up on the back of his neck, and he suspected his visitor was no animal after all. From the far corner of the trailer, he heard the sound again. He began to shiver at this point, and stepped lightly toward the corner of the trailer. The drums were loud from the mountain, and, from where he was, he could see yellow pinpricks of light, torches, winding their way up the side of the mountain. At that moment, my father became aware of a commotion in front of him, the sound of dozens of feet shuffling through the ravine just below the trailer. He eased forward, half of him wanting to flee, the other half unable to look away, until he stood at the edge of the ravine. His breath stopped short. A horde of desert creatures, coyotes, lizards, and birds, were marching together in an unending body through the ravine toward the mountain. As his eyes were taking in the bizarre spectacle, he found something closing in behind him, the feeling you get when someone is standing immediately behind you. Without turning around, My father bolted behind the trailer, hobbling on his leg cast, and sped away in his pickup truck, his heart racing. He didn't return again to the trailer alone. Soon after, he related his experience to some of the locals. They told him of the skinwalkers, members of their community who are secretly witches. They perform atrocious deeds to gain the power to become whatever animal they wear the skin of. My father had seen dozens of these witches heading towards one of their ceremonies. As for the invisible creature stalking him around the trailer, he had no clue. And he would see one of those witches again a few months later. My dad just got back from visiting his parents when he saw it. He had noticed a bird following him the whole ride home. The only reason he hadn't noticed it before was because it was in the bed of his truck. His friend was out at the bar when he walked in, so all the lights were off. When he was in the kitchen making supper, he heard drums again.
Oh hell no. No way in hell am I messing with that shit again.
So, he went and grabbed his gun off the rack and went outside. He looked up the window to his room and saw the bird had been following him all day. He loaded the gun and shot. To this day, he swears the drum stopped exactly as the bullet hit the bird. The bird morphed. It started writhing on the ground until an old woman lay there in a pool of blood. He heard a rustling on the other side of the trailer. That's when he felt a pain in his side. He said that a lizard had crawled up his pants and bit his side. The pain only intensified as the saliva entered his blood. He jumped back into his truck and called his friend, telling him not to come back. Then, my dad drove himself to a hospital because his side was feeling like hell. The doctor checked him out and said he had never seen anything like it before. The marks seemed to be sinking in instead of going away. They kept him overnight, and eventually, my dad fell asleep. After a while, my dad woke up and found the marks disappeared. To this day, he refuses to go back to the Four Corners area for fear the skinwalkers will remember him.